Imagine controlling the financial fate of an empire that stretched across 3 continents, and doing it from a single counting house in Constantinople. That's not a metaphor. That's the Camondo family. At their peak in the mid-19th century, the Camondos didn't just manage money, they were the money. The Ottoman Empire's most critical state loans, its war financing, its currency stabilization mechanisms, all of it ran through the hands of one Jewish banking dynasty that most people today have never heard of. A dynasty so powerful that sultans sent personal emissaries to their doorstep, so trusted that the French government sought their counsel when restructuring European debt markets, and so wealthy that when they finally relocated to Paris, they constructed a hotel particulier on the Rue de Monceau that made even Parisian aristocrats uncomfortable. But here's what most people don't know. Behind the gilded ledgers and imperial appointments was a story stitched together from exile, persecution, and the kind of resilience that only centuries of displacement can forge. The Camondos were Sephardic Jews, descendants of those expelled from Spain in 1492, who built their empire not from inherited privilege, but from a ruthless understanding of how credit, trust, and political timing intersect. And the tragedy? It came not from the boardroom, it came from a cattle car heading to Auschwitz in 1944. This is the story of the Camondo family. Bankers, philanthropists, collectors, Ottoman power brokers, and ultimately, victims of the very civilization they helped finance. From the narrow streets of the Constantinople Jewish quarter to the salons of Belle Epoque Paris, from the palace corridors of Dolmabach to the silent rooms of a museum no one visits without weeping. This is a story of wealth, power, tragedy, and the kind of innovation that reshapes history without ever making the headlines. Buckle in. This one doesn't have a clean ending. By the time Abraham Salomon Camondo died in 1873, he had accumulated a fortune that placed him comfortably among the wealthiest men in Europe, not just in the Ottoman Empire. Europe, he had personally brokered state loans worth hundreds of millions of francs, helped establish the first modern bank on Ottoman soil, negotiated the emancipation of Ottoman Jews directly with the Sultan's court, and laid the groundwork for a family legacy so complex, so layered, and ultimately so heartbreaking that it defies easy categorization. What most people don't know is that none of this was supposed to happen. The Camondos were not born into the corridors of power. They didn't inherit a merchant empire or arrive in Constantinople with a chest of gold and a letter of introduction from a European monarch. Their story begins in the kind of obscurity that makes the eventual grandeur seem almost implausible. A community of Jewish merchants operating within the tight confines of the Ottoman millet system, navigating a world that simultaneously tolerated and marginalized them, offering opportunity with one hand and restriction with the other. Let me take you back to the early 19th century, specifically to Constantinople in the 1820s, when the Ottoman Empire was undergoing one of the most turbulent periods in its centuries-long history. Sultan Mahmud II had just abolished the Janissaries, the elite military corps that had functioned as a shadow government within the empire for over 3 centuries, in what became known as the Auspicious Incident of 1826. The entire imperial financial apparatus was being restructured from scratch. Old patronage networks had collapsed overnight. Military and administrative systems that once consumed the bulk of imperial revenue were being dismantled and rebuilt under new, modernized frameworks. And where there is institutional chaos, there is always an opening for those nimble enough to step into the vacuum. The Camondo family stepped in. But to understand why they were positioned to do so, why a Sephardic Jewish banking family from Constantinople's Balad Quarter was even in a position to engage with Ottoman state finance at this level, we need to go much further back, to 1492, to the expulsion from Spain, to the long, slow, centuries-long process of building trust, expertise, and financial infrastructure within the Ottoman world that made the Camondos' 19th century dominance not just possible, but almost inevitable. The atmosphere of Constantinople in the early 1800s was unlike anything in the Western world. The city straddled 2 continents in every sense, geographically, culturally, economically. The Bosphorus was one of the most trafficked waterways on Earth. The Grand Bazaar processed commercial transactions in dozens of currencies simultaneously. The Galata district, just across the Golden Horn from the Old City, had been a hub of international finance since the Genoese established their trading colony there in the 14th century. By the early 19th century, Galata was home to a dense web of money changers, merchants, and early proto-bankers from Greek, Armenian, Jewish, and European backgrounds. It was, in modern parlance, a financial district, chaotic, competitive, and extraordinarily lucrative for those who understood its rhythms. This wasn't just about money. Behind the wealth that the Camondos were beginning to accumulate was a deeper truth. They understood that in the Ottoman system, financial power and political access were inseparable. You couldn't have one without the other, and you couldn't maintain either without an impeccable reputation for reliability, for paying your debts, honoring your commitments, and delivering on promises made to men who could end your family's existence with a single decree. That understanding, that fusion of financial sophistication and political intelligence, is what separated the Camondos from the dozens of other banking families operating in Galata at the time. And it all started with a community that had been perfecting the art of financial survival for 300 years. Before there was a banking empire, before there were palaces in Paris or audiences with sultans, there was a synagogue in Constantinople's Ballet Quarter, and inside it, the accumulated memory of an expulsion that had happened 3 centuries earlier but never really ended. To understand the Camondos, you first have to understand what it meant to be Sephardic in the Ottoman world. Because the empire they would one day help finance was also the empire that had, 300 years before their rise, offered their ancestors refuge when all of Europe had turned its back. That debt, cultural, emotional, and deeply practical, shaped everything that followed. The year is 1492, the same year Christopher Columbus set sail from Palos de la Frontera with a fleet of 3 ships and a mandate to find a western route to Asia. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain issued the Alhambra Decree, an edict ordering the complete expulsion of all practicing Jews from the Iberian Peninsula. The timing was not coincidental. The Spanish Inquisition had been operating for over a decade. The theological and political machinery of Reconquista Spain demanded religious homogeneity. Approximately 100,000 to 200,000 Jews, historians still debate the exact numbers, were given 4 months to either convert or leave. Those who left took almost nothing. They took their Torah scrolls, their family names, their languages, their trades, and their memory. And Sultan Bayezid II of the Ottoman Empire sent ships to collect them. The famous account, possibly apocryphal but too perfectly constructed to ignore, has Bayezid reportedly remarking that Ferdinand had impoverished his own kingdom by expelling such skilled and productive subjects while simultaneously enriching the Ottoman Empire. Whether he said it or not, the sentiment captured a genuine geopolitical calculation. The Sephardic Jews brought with them expertise in medicine, metallurgy, diplomacy, textile manufacturing, and, critically, international commerce and finance. They had managed the financial infrastructure of one of Europe's most sophisticated kingdoms. They brought those skills to their new home. They settled throughout the empire, in Thessaloniki, which became one of the most heavily Jewish cities in the Mediterranean world, in Safed, which became a center of Jewish mystical and legal scholarship, in Izmir, in Edirne, and in Constantinople itself, where they established the Balat and Haskoy quarters along the banks of the Golden Horn. The Camondo family's precise origins in this migration are somewhat obscured by the kind of incomplete documentation that characterizes the records of most displaced communities. What historians have established is that the family was of Sephardic origin, almost certainly from Spain or possibly from Venice, where there was a significant Sephardic community, and that they were established in Constantinople by the late 18th century at the latest. The name Camondo itself has been traced to possible Venetian or Spanish etymology, though the evidence is not conclusive in either direction. What is clear is that by the early 19th century, the Camondo family was operating as sarafs, money changers and informal bankers, within the Ottoman commercial ecosystem. The saraf was a specific and crucial figure in Ottoman economic life. Think of them as the connective tissue of the empire's financial system. Because the Ottoman state, for much of its history, lacked a centralized banking infrastructure, in the European sense, the sarafs filled that gap. They changed currencies, extended credit, managed the cash flows of merchants and officials, and increasingly, as the empire modernized and its financial needs grew more complex, they acted as intermediaries between the imperial treasury and the external world of European capital markets. Being a successful saraf required a very specific combination of skills. You needed financial literacy, obviously, the ability to calculate exchange rates across dozens of different currencies, to assess credit worthiness, to structure repayment terms. But you also needed something less quantifiable, a network, a web of relationships stretching from the imperial palace down to the individual merchant in the bazaar, and outward to the trading houses and banks of Vienna, Amsterdam, London, and Paris. The Sephardic community had spent 3 centuries building exactly that kind of network. Their common language, Ladino, the Judeo-Spanish dialect that Sephardic Jews preserved with remarkable fidelity across centuries of diaspora, functioned as a commercial lingua franca across the Mediterranean. Their family structures, often sprawling and deliberately maintained across multiple cities, created natural correspondent banking relationships long before the term existed as a formal financial concept. If you were a Camondo in Constantinople and you needed to execute a transaction in Livorno or Amsterdam, you likely had a cousin or a brother-in-law or a communal contact there who could be trusted to handle it. The Camondos were playing this game by the early 1800s, and they were playing it very well. Here's what's interesting. The period of their initial rise coincided precisely with the beginning of the Ottoman Empire's long, painful encounter with European financial modernity. The Tanzimat reforms, the sweeping modernization program that the Ottoman state undertook beginning in earnest in 1839, was still a decade away, but the pressures that would make them necessary were already building. The empire was increasingly dependent on imported European goods, which meant chronic trade deficits and a persistent need to source hard European currency. It was fighting increasingly expensive wars. The Greek War of Independence, beginning in 1821, was a catastrophic drain on imperial resources, and its traditional tax collection mechanisms, which relied on farming out revenue collection to local notables and officials who took enormous cuts for themselves, were generating less and less reliable income. The empire needed money. It needed sophisticated financial intermediaries who could navigate the gap between Ottoman economic practice and European financial expectations. And it needed people who had the trust of both sides. The Camondos had built themselves into exactly that position. By the 1820s and 1830s, the family, with Abraham Salomon Camondo increasingly at its head, was executing financial operations of a scale and complexity that went far beyond simple currency exchange. They were extending credit to Ottoman officials and merchants. They were managing remittances for wealthy families with interests across the empire. They were beginning to develop the relationships with European financial houses that would, within a generation, allow them to act as direct conduits for European capital investment in the Ottoman economy. Abraham Salomon, born around 1781, was the figure who transformed the family from prosperous sarafs into genuine financial power brokers. The specific details of his early life are frustratingly sparse. The Ottoman archives of this period are rich but selectively preserved, and the records of minority communities within the empire are particularly fragmented. What we know is that he was operating a substantial banking house in Galata by the 1820s, and that he had established enough credibility within Ottoman official circles to begin receiving the kind of commissions, managing portions of military payrolls, facilitating grain purchases, executing foreign exchange transactions on behalf of government ministries. That marked the transition from private merchant banker to quasi-official financial agent. The implications of this positioning were enormous. An official relationship with the Ottoman state, however informal by European standards, provided both protection and access. It meant that the Camondo house could not simply be expropriated or harassed by local officials in the way that less well-connected minority merchants occasionally were. It meant that when the state needed financial services, the family was already in the room, and the Ottoman state, in the 1820s and 1830s, needed financial services more desperately than it had in generations. But the real transformation, the moment when the Camondos crossed from being significant players to being indispensable ones, was still ahead. Because in Constantinople in the 1830s, something was about to happen that would restructure the entire Ottoman financial system, and in the process, hand the Camondo family an opportunity so large that not even they could have anticipated its full dimensions. The empire was about to start borrowing from Europe, and it had no idea what it was getting into. There is a moment in the life of any banking dynasty when it crosses an invisible line, when it stops being a family that provides financial services and becomes a family that shapes financial reality. For the Rothschilds of Frankfurt, that moment came during the Napoleonic Wars. For the Barings of London, it came during the restructuring of post-revolutionary French debt. For the Camondos of Constantinople, it came in the 1840s, when the Ottoman Empire made the decision that would define its financial trajectory for the next century. It decided to enter the international bond market. Abraham Salomon Camondo was waiting. By 1840, the Ottoman Empire was in a fiscal condition that can be described, without exaggeration, as dire. The Greek War of Independence had consumed resources on a staggering scale throughout the 1820s. The brief but destructive war with Egypt in the early 1830s, when the forces of Muhammad Ali nearly reached Constantinople before European intervention stopped them, had shattered what remained of the imperial military and financial balance. Sultan Mahmud II had died in 1839, just as he was beginning the Tanzimat reform program, leaving his young son, Abdulmesid I, to navigate a collapsing treasury, a demoralized military, and a reformist agenda that itself required enormous investment to implement. The Tanzimat, the word means reorganization in Ottoman Turkish, was not simply a bureaucratic reshuffling. It was the Ottoman state's attempt to fundamentally modernize its administrative, legal, and economic structures along European lines, establishing new secular courts, reforming land tenure, creating a new military, building modern infrastructure. All of this required capital, enormous amounts of capital that the empire simply did not possess. The solution that the Ottoman reformers arrived at was the same one that European states had been using since the 17th century: issue bonds, borrow money from investors, domestic and international, against promises of future repayment from state revenues. The concept was straightforward. The execution was anything but. Here's the thing. The Ottoman Empire in 1840 had no credit rating in any meaningful sense. European banks and investors had essentially no framework for assessing its creditworthiness. It had no central bank. It had no unified currency. It had no standardized accounting system. Its budget, to the extent that one existed in a formal sense, was not published, not audited, and not consistently maintained. From the perspective of a sophisticated European investor, lending money to the Ottoman state was a bit like lending money to a very large, very complicated household that kept its accounts in multiple languages across a dozen different ledgers, and whose head of household changed periodically in ways that were not always peaceful. This is where intermediaries became absolutely essential. What the Ottoman state needed was someone who could simultaneously speak the language of European finance and the language of Ottoman political reality. Someone who had the trust of both Abdülmecid's court and the great European banking houses. Someone who understood how to structure a loan in terms that London and Paris would accept, while navigating the internal politics of the Ottoman bureaucracy well enough to ensure that the money actually reached its intended destination and the repayments were actually made. I mean, consider the complexity of that position for a moment. You were essentially bridging two entirely different financial cultures, one rooted in centuries of European commercial law, standardized instruments, and market-based pricing of risk. The other rooted in a system of personal relationships, imperial prerogative, and a tradition of debt management that operated on entirely different assumptions about obligation, time, and the relationship between sovereign and creditor. The Camondo banking house, by the 1840s, was one of a small handful of Constantinople-based institutions with the network, the experience, and the credibility to occupy that bridging position. They had correspondent relationships with major European houses, relationships that had been built carefully over decades through the Sephardic commercial network and through the Camondo family's own increasingly direct engagement with European financial markets. They had deep relationships within the Ottoman bureaucracy, with the officials of the Sublime Porte, with the treasury officials, with the palace establishment, and they had something that no amount of financial engineering could manufacture: a track record. Decades of transactions executed reliably, debts honored, commitments kept. Abraham Salomon Camondo moved aggressively into this space. The family began participating in the issuance of kaime, Ottoman paper currency, in the 1840s, serving as one of the primary distribution agents for a financial instrument that the Ottoman state was deploying for the first time. The kaim was an innovation born of desperation. The empire simply didn't have enough metallic currency to meet its obligations, so it began issuing paper notes backed by, well, by the promise of the Ottoman government, which in practice meant backed by nothing more than confidence and the threat of state enforcement. Managing Caimondo distribution required exactly the kind of trusted intermediary network that the Camondos had built. More significantly, the family became directly involved in the broader restructuring of Ottoman state finance that accompanied the Tanzimat reforms. When the Ottoman government moved to consolidate and rationalize its debt management in the 1840s, the Camondo House was among the institutions brought in to assist. This wasn't a minor consulting role. This was active participation in the architecture of the imperial financial system, advising on debt structure, participating in loan syndications, managing the mechanics of interest payments to European creditors, who were increasingly nervous about whether the Ottoman state could sustain its obligations. The Crimean War, which broke out in 1853, represents a critical inflection point in this story. The Ottoman Empire, Britain, France, and Sardinia against Russia. The conflict lasted until 1856 and transformed the Ottoman financial situation in ways that were simultaneously positive and devastating. Positive because the alliance with Britain and France injected enormous amounts of capital into the Ottoman economy through wartime expenditures, military supplies, and the first formal international loans that the empire had ever contracted in European markets. Devastating because it established a pattern of deficit spending and external borrowing that the empire would never fully escape. The Camondos were involved in the financial mechanics of this period at multiple levels. They participated in loan syndications, managed portions of the military finance, and, crucially, used the period to deepen their relationships with the great European houses that were now actively engaging with Ottoman credit for the first time. The Crimean War era was when the Camondo name became known in the financial capitals of Europe, not just as a Constantinople-based house, but as a serious player capable of operating at the highest levels of international finance. The results were staggering by any measure. By the 1850s, the Camondo banking house was operating on a scale that made it one of the largest financial institutions in the Eastern Mediterranean. Its balance sheet, reconstructed by historians from Ottoman treasury records and European banking correspondence, reflected operations in the millions of Ottoman lira, at a time when that represented genuinely imperial-scale capital deployment. Abraham Salomon Camondo had transformed what his predecessors built into something qualitatively different. Not a family business that happened to deal in money, but a genuine financial institution with systemic importance to the Ottoman state. This success brought with it something the family had been working toward for decades: formal recognition. In 1867, Abraham Salomon Camondo was granted the title of Count by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a rare honor for a Jewish banker from the Ottoman world, and a signal of just how thoroughly the family had penetrated the uppermost echelons of European as well as Ottoman elite society. But the title was almost a distraction from what was really happening. Because even as Abraham Salomon Camondo was being celebrated in European salons and Ottoman palace corridors, he was also quietly orchestrating something that his peers had never attempted: the construction of a formal banking institution that would bring Western financial infrastructure to Ottoman soil permanently and structurally for the first time. The real innovation was still coming. Building a banking dynasty through personal relationships and accumulated trust is one thing. Institutionalizing that power, converting the informal influence of a family into permanent financial infrastructure that outlasts any individual, is something else entirely. Something harder, something more ambitious, and something that, when it works, reshapes the economic landscape for generations. In the 1850s and 1860s, Abraham Salomon Camondo attempted exactly that kind of institutionalization. And what he built in the process wasn't just a business, it was a blueprint for modern banking in the Middle East. The Galata district of Constantinople in the mid-19th century was one of the most financially dense neighborhoods on Earth. Within a few square blocks, you had the representative offices of major European trading houses: French, British, Italian, Dutch, Austrian. You had the money changers' stalls that had operated continuously since the Genoese had first established the area as a trading colony centuries earlier. You had the offices of the Greek and Armenian banking families, who had long competed with the Camondos for Ottoman financial patronage. And you had, increasingly, the representatives of the great European banking dynasties, the Rothschilds, the Barings, the Credit Mobilier, who were beginning to take a serious interest in Ottoman bond markets. Into this environment, Abraham Salomon Camondo brought a vision: a formal bank, not a counting house, not a family office, a proper institution with defined capital, formal governance structures, standardized procedures, and, crucially, the scale to engage with the growing demands of Ottoman state finance in a way that even the most successful family banking house could not sustain indefinitely on its own. The establishment of the Camondo banking house as a formal institutional entity, what contemporaries began referring to as the Camondo Bank, represented a genuine organizational innovation in the Ottoman financial landscape of the 1850s. To appreciate why this mattered, you have to understand what came before it. For most of Ottoman financial history, the state had dealt with money through a combination of internal treasury operations, the imperial revenue system, which collected taxes and managed disbursements, and a shifting network of external private intermediaries, the sarafs and their equivalents, who provided credit, currency exchange, and various financial services on essentially ad hoc terms. There was no central bank. There was no institution that systematically aggregated deposits, managed reserves, and deployed capital according to established rules. There was no framework for pricing credit systematically, for managing interest rates, or for creating standardized financial instruments. The Camondo Bank was not a central bank. That would come later, with the establishment of the Ottoman Bank in 1856, in which the Camondos also played a foundational role. But it was something important, a demonstration that formal banking was viable in the Ottoman context, a proof of concept, a working model. Look, the operational details of the Camondo Bank are not fully reconstructible from surviving records. But from what historians have pieced together through Ottoman treasury correspondence, European banking archives, and the records of the Camondo family themselves, the institution was operating on a model that combined elements of merchant banking, investment banking, and deposit banking in a way that anticipated structures that wouldn't become standard in Western financial systems until decades later. The bank extended credit to Ottoman merchants and officials at a time when the alternatives were either the brutally expensive informal credit markets or the increasingly unreliable official treasury. It managed foreign exchange transactions with European financial centers, maintaining the correspondent banking relationships that were essential for a state that was increasingly dependent on imported goods and external capital. It participated in Ottoman government bond issuances, both distributing bonds to domestic investors and acting as intermediary with European buyers. And it managed portions of the tax farming revenues that the Ottoman state still relied on for a significant portion of its income, a role that required both deep knowledge of Ottoman provincial economics and the political sensitivity to navigate the complex web of interests that surrounded revenue collection in the empire. The timing of the Camondo Bank's institutional development was not accidental. The 1856 establishment of the Ottoman Bank, created as a joint venture between British and French capital specifically to manage Ottoman state finances and serve as a quasi-central bank, initially seemed like it might marginalize the Camondos by bringing in better capitalized European institutions to dominate Ottoman banking. The Camondos responded with characteristic intelligence. Rather than positioning themselves as competitors to the Ottoman Bank, they worked to become its essential local partners. They had knowledge, relationships, and operational infrastructure that the European managers of the Ottoman Bank simply did not possess and could not quickly acquire. The Camondos knew which provincial tax farmers were reliable and which were not. They knew which Ottoman officials were genuinely committed to the Tanzimat reforms and which were using the reform apparatus to line their pockets. They knew how the empire's internal credit markets actually worked, beneath the formal structures that the European banks were trying to impose. This intelligence was invaluable, and the Camondos leveraged it masterfully. What's interesting is that during this same period, Abraham Salomon Camondo was simultaneously pursuing an agenda that went far beyond financial profit. He was deeply involved in the political effort to improve the legal and social status of Ottoman Jews, a project that combined genuine philanthropic commitment with a shrewd understanding of how the political liberalization associated with the Tanzimat could be channeled in directions that benefited the Jewish community specifically. The Tanzimat reforms had, in principle, established equality of treatment for all Ottoman subjects regardless of religion. In practice, the implementation was uneven and contested. Jewish communities throughout the empire faced ongoing legal disadvantages in property rights, in access to certain commercial sectors, in their dealings with state institutions. Abraham Salomon Camondo used his access to the Ottoman court and his financial leverage to push systematically for the removal of these restrictions. His most famous intervention was his direct engagement with Sultan Abdul-Masih I in the late 1840s and early 1850s on behalf of the Jewish communities of the Holy Land, particularly in Jerusalem, where a crisis involving property rights and community governance had created a genuinely dangerous situation. Camondo's intervention, combining diplomatic representation with the implicit understanding that his financial services were valuable to the Ottoman state, helped resolve the situation in terms favorable to the Jewish community. He did similar work domestically, using his influence to lobby for changes in the rules governing Jewish access to land ownership, professional licensure, and participation in Ottoman official life. These weren't just acts of charity. They were strategic investments in the long-term position of the Sephardic community within Ottoman society, a recognition that financial power without legal security was always fragile. Consider this. Abraham Salomon Camondo was doing what the great European banking dynasties had always done in their home markets, using financial leverage to shape the political and legal environment in which they operated. The Rothschilds had used their financial power to push for Jewish emancipation in Britain and France. The Camondos were doing the same thing in the Ottoman Empire. Different setting, same fundamental logic, same remarkable result. By the 1860s, the scope of Camondo financial operations was genuinely staggering. The family was executing transactions across multiple currencies: Ottoman lira, French francs, British pounds sterling, Austrian florins, Russian rubles. Simultaneously, they were maintaining active operations in Constantinople, Galata, and increasingly in European financial centers. Their network of agents, correspondents, and business contacts spanned the empire from Cairo to Bulgaria and extended across the Mediterranean into France, Italy, and Austria. The financial consequences were transformative for the Ottoman state. The Camondos helped regularize the management of Ottoman government debt at a critical moment when the empire's credibility with European investors was shaky at best. They provided the kind of reliable financial intermediation that allowed the Ottoman government to access European capital markets, which it desperately needed, without being entirely at the mercy of the major European banks, which had their own agendas and were not always sympathetic to Ottoman interests. And the philanthropic consequences were equally significant. Abraham Salomon Camondo's interventions on behalf of Ottoman Jews helped create the legal and social conditions for a more economically integrated Jewish community, one that could participate more fully in Ottoman commercial and professional life. This wasn't purely altruistic, but it was enormously beneficial regardless of the motivation. But here's the thing. All of this, the institutional banking, the philanthropic intervention, the expansion of the financial network, was built on a single, ultimately precarious assumption: that the Ottoman state would remain capable of servicing its debts, honoring its commitments, and maintaining the political stability that made the whole system function. And by the 1860s, there were increasingly alarming signs that this assumption might not hold. The question was no longer whether the Ottoman Empire was in financial trouble. The question was how bad it would get, and what the Camondos would do when the crisis finally arrived. There are families who make money from empires. And then there are families who, for a brief, extraordinary window, essentially become the financial nervous system of an empire, whose decisions ripple through state budgets, military capabilities, and the daily lives of millions of people who never knew the family existed. In the 1860s and early 1870s, the Camondos occupied that second position. They weren't just bankers to the Ottoman state. They were, in a very real sense, its financial architects, the people who designed the structures through which money flowed, debt was managed, and the machinery of one of the world's last great dynastic empires was kept running. Istanbul, 1863. The Dolmabahce Palace, completed only a decade earlier, at a cost that had itself contributed significantly to the Ottoman treasury's growing stress, gleamed white on the European shore of the Bosphorus. Sultan Abdulaziz had just succeeded his brother Abdul-Masih on the Ottoman throne, inheriting both the reformist momentum of the Tanzimat and its increasingly alarming financial consequences. The numbers were not good. The Ottoman public debt, accumulated through decades of war financing and the fiscal pressures of modernization, was growing faster than the empire's revenues. Interest payments on European loans were consuming an ever larger share of the imperial budget. Tax collection remained inefficient and often corrupt. The Crimean War had been won, in the sense that the alliance with Britain and France had driven the Russians back, but the financial cost had been enormous, and the loans contracted to fight it were now pressing heavily on the imperial treasury. Abdulaziz was a more conservative figure than his predecessor, suspicious of European influence and inclined toward a more assertive Ottoman nationalism. But he was not immune to financial reality, and the financial reality was inescapable. The empire needed access to European capital markets, and accessing those markets required intermediaries who could make the Ottoman state legible and credible to European investors. The early 1860s saw the Camondo family's involvement in Ottoman state finance reach its most direct and consequential form. Abraham Salomon Camondo, now in his 80s, but still mentally formidable, still directing the family's financial strategy with what contemporaries described as remarkable clarity, was joined increasingly by his grandsons Nissim and Abraham Behor de Camondo, who were being groomed to take over the family's operations. The generational transition was itself managed with characteristic Camondo precision. Gradual, carefully supervised, with the older generation remaining actively involved long enough to ensure that relationships and institutional knowledge were properly transferred. The specific mechanics of the Camondo family's involvement in Ottoman state finance during this period operated on several levels simultaneously. At the most direct level, they were participating in loan syndications, the process by which large government borrowing requirements were packaged into tradable bonds and distributed to investors. When the Ottoman government needed to raise 10 million or 15 million francs, it couldn't simply walk into a European bank and ask for a check. It needed to structure a bond issue, define the terms of the loan, the interest rate, the repayment schedule, the collateral, the currency of denomination, and the distribution mechanism. Then it needed to find investors, banks, wealthy individuals, institutional buyers, willing to purchase those bonds at a price that reflected both the return on offer and the perceived risk of lending to the Ottoman state. The Camondo house served as a critical node in this process. On the Ottoman side, they helped structure the terms of loan issues in ways that were financially sustainable, or at least financially defensible, given the empire's revenue situation. On the European side, they leveraged their correspondent relationships and their reputation to place Ottoman bonds with investors who might otherwise have been skeptical. They acted as market makers, standing ready to buy back bonds from investors who needed liquidity, thereby making Ottoman government debt more attractive to the kind of cautious institutional investors who needed to know they could exit a position if necessary. Beyond loan syndications, the Camondos were deeply involved in the management of the tax farming system, the iltizam, that remained the backbone of Ottoman revenue collection, even as the Tanzimat reformers were trying to modernize it. Tax farming was essentially the privatization of tax collection. The government auctioned the right to collect taxes in specific territories to private entrepreneurs, who paid a lump sum up front and then collected as much as they could from the local population, keeping the difference as profit. The system was economically inefficient and often oppressive. The tax farmers had every incentive to squeeze as much as possible from the people under their jurisdiction, but it was administratively convenient for a central government that lacked the bureaucratic capacity to collect taxes directly across a vast, poorly mapped, multilingual empire. The Camondos participated in iltizam arrangements both directly, financing the operations of tax farmers, who often needed working capital to make their upfront payments, and indirectly, through their involvement in the state revenue management structures that were evolving under the Tanzimat reforms. This put them in an uncomfortable ethical position. The tax farming system was, by any reasonable assessment, exploitative. The people at the bottom of it, the Anatolian peasants, the Balkan farmers, the Arab landholders who ultimately bore the tax burden, had very little recourse against tax farmers who demanded more than the law permitted. The Camondos' financial involvement in this system made them, however indirectly, participants in those extractions. Here's what's interesting. This ethical complexity wasn't unique to the Camondos. It was the central dilemma of all 19th century international finance in developing markets. The European banks that held Ottoman government bonds were also, by extension, financing the tax collection that generated the revenues to service those bonds. The Rothschilds, who lent to the Ottoman state, were as implicated in its revenue extraction systems as the Camondos, who managed portions of that system locally. The difference was distance and visibility. The European investors were far enough removed from the actual mechanics of Ottoman tax collection to maintain comfortable ignorance. The Camondos were not. What the Camondos did do, and this is documented in contemporaneous accounts, was use their influence to moderate some of the worst excesses of the system in areas where they had direct involvement. They pushed for clearer accounting, more predictable collection schedules, and the kinds of regularization that reduced the arbitrary extraction that made the iltizam so oppressive in its worst forms. This was not altruism. It was good financial management. Predictable, sustainable revenue flows were more valuable to creditors than the unpredictable boom and bust of unregulated extraction. But the effect in specific locations and situations was genuinely ameliorative. The period also saw the Camondos playing a direct role in one of the most consequential institutional developments in Ottoman financial history, the expansion and reshaping of the Ottoman Bank. Established in 1856 with primarily British capital, the Ottoman Bank was reorganized in 1863 as the Imperial Ottoman Bank, now with French capital as the dominant partner and a broader mandate as the sole institution authorized to issue banknotes in the empire, making it effectively the Ottoman Central Bank. The Camondos were involved in the negotiations surrounding this reorganization. Using their relationships with both the Ottoman court and the French banking establishment, they had by this point established strong ties with French financial houses, connections that would soon take on a very different significance. To help shape the institution's structure in ways that preserved space for locally based banking operations alongside the European-managed imperial institution, the personal costs of operating at this level were considerable, though they appear rarely in the historical record. Abraham Salomon Camondo was by the 1860s a very old man, carrying an extraordinary burden of institutional knowledge and relationship management. His grandsons were capable, genuinely talented by all contemporary accounts, but they were navigating a financial environment that was becoming rapidly more complex and increasingly more dangerous. The scale of the Camondo operation at its peak is difficult to overstate. Contemporary estimates, which must be treated with appropriate caution given the limitations of 19th century financial record-keeping, suggest that the Camondo banking house was by the late 1860s managing financial operations equivalent to hundreds of millions of francs annually, making it one of the largest financial institutions in the Eastern Mediterranean by any measure. Their client list spanned the Ottoman imperial family, the major ministries of the Sublime Porte, European trading houses, wealthy merchants across the empire, and an increasingly significant portfolio of European investment clients who had discovered that the Camondo house offered access to Ottoman financial instruments at terms and with levels of service that the purely European banks could not match. But something was shifting, not just in the Ottoman Empire's finances, though the trajectory there was darkening year by year, but within the Camondo family itself. The next generation, Abraham Behor and Nissim de Camondo, were being shaped by a different set of experiences and aspirations than their grandfather. They had spent time in Paris. They had seen what European high society looked like, and they were beginning to wonder whether the future of the Camondo dynasty lay not in Constantinople, but somewhere else entirely. The pull of Paris was becoming irresistible, and the decision to follow it would change everything. Every dynasty faces a moment when the question of where it belongs becomes as important as the question of what it does. For the Camondos, that moment arrived in the 1860s and 1870s, a period when the magnetic pull of Belle Époque Paris was drawing the finest talent, the greatest fortunes, and the most ambitious minds from across Europe and beyond. The decision to reorient the family's center of gravity from Constantinople to Paris was not made in a single dramatic moment. It accumulated, quietly and then suddenly, over the course of a decade that would redefine the Camondo identity in ways that were exhilarating, transformative, and as would only become apparent much later, fatally consequential. Paris in the 1870s and 1880s was experiencing one of the most extraordinary periods of cultural and economic efflorescence in modern history. Baron Haussmann's massive reconstruction of the city, the demolition of medieval Paris, and the construction of the grand boulevards, the arrondissement system, the great parks and public spaces that still define the French capital, had been completed in the 1870s, leaving behind a city of extraordinary physical beauty and civic ambition. The Third Republic, established after the catastrophic Franco-Prussian War and the traumatic Paris Commune of 1870-71, had stabilized into a functioning democratic order that was rapidly building both economic prosperity and cultural prestige. The Parc Monceau neighborhood on the right bank was in the process of becoming the most fashionable address in the city. The great fortunes of the Second Empire, industrialists, bankers, railway magnates, had built their hotels particulars along the Rue de Monceau, the Boulevard Malesherbes, and the surrounding streets, creating a concentration of wealth and architectural ambition that rivaled anything in Europe. The Rothschilds were nearby. The industrial dynasties of the Third Republic were building their palaces. And into this world, the Camondo family began to insert itself with characteristic precision. The movement of the Camondo family from Constantinople to Paris was a multi-generational process that began seriously in the 1860s. Abraham Salomon Camondo himself appears to have encouraged his grandson's engagement with the French financial world. It aligned with the family's long-standing strategy of building deep correspondent relationships with European banking houses, and it opened access to the French capital markets that were becoming increasingly important in Ottoman finance. The grandsons, Abraham Behor de Camondo and Nissim de Camondo, spent significant time in Paris during the 1860s, establishing themselves in French financial and social circles with a facility that suggested both natural aptitude and careful preparation. You see, the Camondos' entry into Parisian society was not simply a matter of buying a house and showing up. Paris in this era had elaborate and well-defended social hierarchies that newcomers, however wealthy, navigated at their peril. The old aristocracy looked down on the new money of the industrial age. The Jewish community, however wealthy and well-established, faced persistent social anti-Semitism that existed in fundamental tension with the legal equality guaranteed by the revolution. And foreign nationals, however cosmopolitan their backgrounds, faced an additional layer of cultural scrutiny. The Camondos handled all of this with a sophistication that speaks to the decades of political intelligence their family had accumulated, operating in the Byzantine complexity of Ottoman court society. They didn't attempt to storm the gates of Parisian aristocratic society. They built their own parallel world, one that attracted to itself the most interesting, most talented, and most forward-looking elements of French cultural and intellectual life. They became collectors, patrons, philanthropists. They engaged with the French world not as supplicants seeking acceptance, but as principals offering something genuinely valuable: extraordinary connoisseurship, global perspectives, and a genuine passion for the French cultural tradition. Abraham Behor de Camondo, who took French citizenship and dropped the Ottoman elements of his personal style as part of a calculated process of cultural assimilation, established himself on the Rue de Monceau by the 1860s. The house he built there was, by all contemporary accounts, extraordinary, a private residence that doubled as a museum-quality display of French decorative arts, with a collection of 18th century furniture, Sèvres porcelain, and works of art that would eventually become one of the finest in private hands anywhere. His son, Count Moïse de Camondo, inherited and amplified this passion to an extraordinary degree. Moïse, born in Constantinople in 1860 but raised and educated in the French world, became one of the most important art collectors of the Belle Époque. His particular obsession was the decorative arts of the French 18th century, the furniture of the great ébénistes who had furnished the court of Louis XV and Louis XVI, the Sèvres and Mason porcelain of the Ancien Régime, the Beauvais tapestries, the Savonnerie carpets. He didn't just collect these objects, he built a house specifically to contain them. A house designed to replicate the aesthetic experience of an 18th century French interior, down to the architectural details of the boiseries and the proportions of the rooms. That house, the Hotel Camondo, completed in its final form in 1914, still stands on the Rue de Monceau. It is now the Musée Nissim de Camondo, named by Moïse for his son Nissim, who died in the First World War. It is one of the most perfectly preserved examples of French decorative arts from the Ancien Régime period anywhere in existence. And walking through it, as this script's researchers did in preparing this documentary, is one of the most uncannily moving experiences available to any visitor to Paris. The rooms are perfect, the objects are extraordinary, and the family that created it is gone. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The Paris pivot was also a financial pivot. The Camondo banking operations, while maintaining their Ottoman roots, were increasingly oriented toward the Paris capital markets by the 1870s. This was partly a strategic response to the Ottoman Empire's deteriorating financial situation, more on that shortly, and partly a recognition that the center of gravity in international finance was shifting westward. London and Paris were the dominant capital markets of the late 19th century. Being physically present in those markets, with relationships in the great French and British banking houses, was increasingly essential for any institution that wanted to operate at the highest levels of international finance. The Camondos established a formal banking presence in Paris, the banking house of Camondo and CIA, that operated alongside the Constantinople operations and increasingly became the more dynamic of the two. The Paris house engaged in the full range of activities characteristic of the haute banque of the Belle Époque, placing bonds, executing foreign exchange transactions, financing international trade, providing wealth management services to the growing pool of wealthy clients, both European and from the Ottoman world, who were drawn into the Camondo network. The timing created both opportunities and complications. The 1870s were, in France, a period of complex anti-Semitic social currents that would eventually crystallize in the Dreyfus Affair of the 1890s, an episode that tore French society apart along fault lines of religion, class, and political allegiance. The Camondos were inevitably caught up in these currents. Their wealth, their prominence, and their Jewish identity made them targets for the kind of coded hostility that characterized French upper-class anti-Semitism in this period. They navigated it with practiced stoicism, maintaining their social position, while avoiding the kind of public political engagement that might have made them more vulnerable. The consequences of the Paris pivot were transformative and, in ways that only became apparent with hindsight, irreversible. By choosing to make France their primary home and France their primary cultural allegiance, the Camondos were making a bet on a political and social order that they believed would provide more security, more stability, and more opportunity than the Ottoman world they were leaving behind. For the generation that made the decision, the bet appeared to pay off. The Camondo name became one of the most prominent in Parisian Jewish high society. The family's wealth, already enormous by any standard, grew further through astute management of their French financial operations. And their cultural legacy, the collection, the house, the philanthropy, became a genuine contribution to French civilization that earned them the kind of social respect that even the most persistent aristocratic anti-Semitism could not entirely negate. But even as the Paris chapter of the Camondo story was opening, the Constantinople chapter was heading toward a denouement that would demonstrate with brutal clarity the limits of financial sophistication in the face of sovereign crisis. The Ottoman Empire was about to default, and the crash, when it came, would reshape the entire Eastern Mediterranean financial world and force the Camondos to make decisions whose consequences would echo long after the immediate crisis had passed. The Ottoman default of 1875 was not a surprise, not to anyone who had been paying attention. The warning signs had been accumulating for years. Interest payments growing as a percentage of budget, new loans being taken to service old loans, revenues consistently failing to meet projections. Everyone in the financial world knew the direction of travel. The question was when, not whether. What nobody anticipated was quite how catastrophic the fallout would be, or how completely it would reshape the political map of southeastern Europe, with consequences that are still playing out today. The Camondos had a front row seat to all of it. By 1875, the Ottoman Empire had accumulated a foreign debt of approximately 200 million Ottoman lira, a figure that represented roughly 5 times the empire's annual revenue. Interest payments alone were consuming roughly half of all state expenditures. The government had been borrowing from Peter to pay Paul for over a decade, taking new loans at increasingly punishing rates to service the interest on existing loans, a pattern that every financial analyst recognized as mathematically unsustainable, but that no one in the imperial government had found a politically viable way to interrupt. The immediate trigger for the default was a combination of natural disaster and political crisis. Devastating floods and droughts in 1873 and 1874 had destroyed harvests across Anatolia and the Balkans, the agricultural heartland of the empire, producing both humanitarian crisis and a catastrophic collapse in the tax revenues that the government was counting on. Simultaneously, the empire was dealing with growing insurgencies in Bosnia and Herzegovina, revolts that would soon escalate into the broader crisis of the Eastern Question, which were consuming military resources at precisely the moment when the treasury was most stressed. On October 6, 1875, the Ottoman government announced that it would be reducing interest payments on its foreign debt by half, a de facto default that sent shockwaves through the bond markets of London, Paris, Amsterdam, and Vienna. Ottoman bonds, which had been trading at significant discounts for months as the market anticipated the inevitable, collapsed further. Investors who had bought Ottoman government debt on the basis of the empire's standing as a sovereign borrower watched their portfolios crater. The Camondos were deeply exposed. As one of the primary intermediaries in Ottoman bond markets, and as investors in their own right, the family held significant positions in Ottoman government debt. The default represented a direct financial hit, the magnitude of which is difficult to reconstruct precisely from available historical sources, but which contemporary accounts suggest was very substantial. More damaging in some ways than the direct financial loss was the reputational exposure. The Camondo house had, for decades, been one of the primary voices assuring European investors that Ottoman government debt was a sound investment. The default forced a reckoning with that positioning. Here's the thing about financial crises: they don't just destroy wealth, they destroy networks. The relationships of trust and mutual obligation that are the real infrastructure of banking, more important than any ledger balance, fracture under the stress of default, bankruptcy, and the recriminations that follow. The Camondos had built their position over generations on the strength of those relationships. The Ottoman default tested every one of them simultaneously. The political consequences of the default were even more catastrophic than the financial ones. The Ottoman fiscal crisis energized nationalist movements in the Balkans that had been building for decades. In 1876, a major uprising in Bulgaria, brutally suppressed by Ottoman irregular forces in what became known as the Bulgarian Horrors, generated an international outcry that transformed the political dynamics of the Eastern Question. Russia, citing the protection of Slavic Orthodox Christians, declared war on the Ottoman Empire in 1877. The subsequent Russo-Turkish War was a military disaster for the Ottomans, ending with the Treaty of San Stefano in 1878 and the subsequent Congress of Berlin, which stripped the empire of vast territories in the Balkans and the Caucasus. For the Camondos, this political unraveling had direct and painful consequences. Their network of relationships, financial operations, and community connections spanned territories that were now being carved away from the empire: Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Bosnia. The communities they had served, the trading relationships they had maintained, the financial infrastructure they had helped build in those regions were all disrupted, in some cases destroyed. The world in which the Camondo house had operated was physically shrinking. The Ottoman government, desperate to stabilize its finances, established the Public Debt Administration in 1881, a remarkable institution in which European creditors essentially took direct control of portions of the Ottoman revenue stream to guarantee debt service payments. The Public Debt Administration, run by a council representing the various European bond-holding interests, with the Ottoman state as a kind of involuntary partner, administered revenues from tobacco, salt, silk, fisheries, and various stamp duties, channeling them directly to service the foreign debt. It was, in effect, the partial colonization of Ottoman fiscal sovereignty by European financial interests. The Camondos had complex relationships with this institution. On one level, as holders of Ottoman government bonds, they had a direct financial interest in the Public Debt Administration's success. It was, after all, the mechanism that made their bond holdings worth something rather than nothing. On another level, the administration represented the triumph of the purely European financial model over the hybrid Ottoman-European approach that the Camondos had embodied. The PDA was run by European managers according to European procedures, with little role for the kind of locally embedded financial intelligence that had been the Camondo family's competitive advantage. Look at the broader pattern. The Ottoman financial crisis of the 1870s and 1880s was, among other things, a story of the limits of financial intermediation in the face of structural sovereign insolvency. The Camondos had managed the empire's access to European capital markets with genuine skill, but no amount of skill could indefinitely sustain a borrowing program that was structurally unsustainable, that was consuming the empire's fiscal space faster than modernization could expand its revenue base. The empire had needed not just better banking, but better governance, better taxation, better economic policy, and the Tanzimat reforms, for all their ambition, had been unable to deliver that transformation fast enough. The personal cost to the Camondo family was also accelerating during this period. Abraham Salomon Camondo, the patriarch, the builder of the dynasty's financial foundations, died in 1873, just as the Ottoman default was becoming inevitable. He died at the end of a life of extraordinary achievement, but also at a moment when the empire he had served was entering its most dangerous period. His grandsons, Abraham Behor and Nissim, inherited an institution under enormous stress, an institution that had to navigate the Ottoman crisis while simultaneously managing the transition of the family's primary base from Constantinople to Paris. The personal dynamics of this transition were themselves complicated. The two brothers who ran the banking operations jointly had somewhat different visions of the family's future. Abraham Behor was more focused on the Paris operations and the cultural and social integration into French high society that the family was pursuing there. Nissim was more attached to the Constantinople roots, more engaged with the Ottoman world that his grandfather had dominated. The tension between these orientations was never fully resolved, and it added an internal dimension to the external pressures the family was navigating. The Ottoman default and its aftermath permanently altered the Camondo family's relationship with the empire they had served. Not broke it, the family maintained significant financial operations in Constantinople into the 1880s and beyond, and continued to have relationships with Ottoman official circles, but the center of gravity had shifted definitively and irreversibly toward Paris. The family that had been for 3 generations the financial architects of the Ottoman state was becoming, generation by generation, a French family with Ottoman roots. The transformation was logical, perhaps even inevitable, but it carried losses as well as gains. And yet, even as the Ottoman chapter was closing, the Paris chapter was opening into something extraordinary. Because the Camondo, who emerged as the dominant figure of the next generation, Count Moïse de Camondo, was going to take the family's trajectory in a direction that his banking ancestors could not have imagined, less interested in finance than in beauty, more consumed by collection than commerce, and more deeply French in his cultural identity than any Camondo before him. The question was whether France would ever fully accept him in return. There is a particular kind of tragedy that operates across generations, where the decisions made by one generation create the conditions for catastrophe that only their descendants will fully experience. The Camondos who moved to Paris in the 1860s and 1870s were making a rational choice based on everything they knew about the world. They could not have known that the civilization they were choosing to join, French, European, cosmopolitan, was, in the span of a few decades, going to collapse into something unimaginable. What followed is not simply the end of a banking dynasty. It is one of the most devastating personal stories of the 20th century. Paris, 1914. The Hotel Camondo on the Rue de Monceau is complete. Count Moïse de Camondo has just finished the final phase of construction and decoration, a project that consumed nearly a decade and represented the culmination of his lifelong obsession with recreating the aesthetic world of 18th century France. The rooms are filled with objects of extraordinary quality and historical significance, furniture by the greatest ébénistes of the Ancien Régime, porcelain from Sèvres and Meissen, tapestries that once hung in royal palaces. The house is, by any assessment, a masterpiece. And then the First World War begins. Moïse de Camondo's only son, Nissim, named for his grandfather, the Ottoman-era patriarch, was 2003 years old when war broke out in August 1914. He enlisted immediately. He served as a military aviator, a reconnaissance and combat pilot in the early years of French military aviation, one of the most dangerous assignments available in a war that was finding new ways to kill young men at an industrial scale. On September 5, 1917, Nissim de Camondo was killed in aerial combat over northeastern France. He was 26 years old. Moïse de Camondo never recovered. Contemporary accounts, letters, and the testimony of people who knew him describe a grief that was total and permanent, the kind of loss that doesn't heal, but instead reorganizes itself into the architecture of a life. He had no other children who survived to adulthood. His marriage to Irene Cahen d'Anvers had ended in divorce, itself a source of profound personal pain, and their two children, Nissim and Beatrice, had been the center of his emotional life. With Nissim gone, the dynasty that Abraham Salomon Camondo had built from the Saraf offices of Galata now had no male heir. Moïse responded by doing something both generous and heartbreaking. He decided to bequeath his house, the Hotel Camondo in its entirety, with its entire contents, to the Union Centrale des Arts Décoratifs, the French decorative arts institution, as a museum. The condition was that the house be preserved exactly as he had built it, that it be named the Musée Nissim de Camondo in memory of his son, and that nothing within it be changed. He was, in effect, building a mausoleum for everything he had loved and lost. Moïse died in 1935, having lived his last 20 years in a state of refined, meticulous grief. He had completed the legal arrangements for the bequest. He had left detailed notes about the provenance of every object in the collection. He had done everything a responsible custodian of cultural heritage could do. But here's the devastating truth. He did not know what was coming for the family that remained. His daughter Beatrice had married a man named Léon Reinach, a musician and classical scholar of genuine distinction. They had two children, Fanny, born in 1920, and Bertrand, born in 1923. By the late 1930s, the family was living in the shadow of what was happening in Germany: the rise of Nazism, the systematic persecution of Jews, the increasingly urgent warnings from those who could see where the trajectory was heading. France fell to Nazi Germany in June 1940. The Vichy government established its anti-Jewish laws within months, stripping French Jews of their citizenship rights, their professional positions, their property to participate in French civic life. For the Camondo family, the legal equality that France had seemed to offer, the equality that had made the decision to become French seem so rational and so sound in the 1860s and 1870s, dissolved overnight. Think about that for a moment. The family had been French for 3 generations. Moïse's father had taken French citizenship in the 1860s. Moïse himself had been born in Constantinople but raised in Paris, educated in France, served in French cultural institutions, paid French taxes, fought under the French flag. His son had died for France, and none of it made any difference under Vichy. Beatrice, her husband Léon, and their children Fanny and Bertrand were arrested in November 1943. They were held in the French internment camp at Drancy, the primary transit camp through which French Jews were funneled toward the Nazi death camps in the east. On March 20, 1944, they were deported to Auschwitz. None of them survived. Beatrice de Camondo Reinach died at Auschwitz. Her husband, Léon Reinach, died at Auschwitz. Their daughter, Fanny, 23 years old, died at Auschwitz. Their son, Bertrand, 20 years old, died at Auschwitz. The entire last generation of the Camondo family, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the bankers who had helped finance the Ottoman Empire, the descendants of Abraham Salomon Camondo, who had once negotiated with sultans and European banking dynasties with equal authority, was annihilated in a Nazi death camp in Poland in 1944. What makes this particularly, almost unbearably poignant is the contrast with the house on the Rue de Monceau. The Hotel Camondo, the Musée Nissim de Camondo, survived the war intact. The Germans did not loot it. The Vichy government did not seize it. The objects that Moïse had spent his life collecting, the rooms he had spent decades perfecting, the house he had dedicated to his dead son, all of it survived, immaculate and undisturbed, while the family it commemorated was being murdered. The museum opened to the public in 1936, a year after Moïse's death. It has been open almost continuously ever since. You can walk through it today. You can see the Meissen dinner service. You can sit in the reading room where Moïse worked. You can look at the framed photograph of Nissim in his aviator's uniform that still hangs in the house where his father grieved for him. The house is perfect. The family is gone. And the contrast between those two facts is, perhaps, the most devastating statement about the 20th century that any museum in Europe makes. The murder of the Reinach family at Auschwitz represents the terminal point of the Camondo direct lineage. The banking dynasty, from the Sarafs of Galata to the Counts of Paris, ended not in bankruptcy or political reversal, but in genocide. The empire they had helped finance had collapsed. The civilization they had chosen to join had turned on them, and the house that stood as their memorial was a monument not just to their achievements, but to the completeness of their destruction. But legacies, unlike families, are not so easily destroyed, because what the Camondos built in both the Ottoman Empire and in France did not disappear with them. It persisted in institutions, in architectural precedents, in financial innovations, and in a museum that continues to tell their story to visitors from around the world who arrive knowing very little and leave knowing they have encountered something that demands to be remembered. The legacy was already outlasting the dynasty. The question is what it means. The greatest test of any legacy is not how it looks at the moment of its creation. It's what it means to people who encounter it a century later, without the benefit of knowing the people who made it, in a world those people could not have imagined. The Camondo legacy, financial, cultural, humanitarian, has passed that test in ways that are sometimes surprising, always complex, and occasionally profoundly uncomfortable. What the Camondos left behind is not just a museum on the Rue de Monceau, though that would be significant enough. It's a set of financial innovations, institutional precedents, and human choices whose consequences are still traceable in the modern world. Walk through the financial district of Istanbul today, through the glass towers and trading floors of the modern Turkish financial system, and you are walking through an institutional landscape that has its roots, however deeply buried, in the transformations of the 19th century. The H Bankası, the Garanti Bank, the Halkbank, the modern Turkish banking system is the product of a century of institutional development that began with the Ottoman banking reforms of the 1850s and 1860s. The Camondo family's role in those reforms was formative. They helped establish the proof of concept that formal institutional banking was viable in the Ottoman context, at a moment when that was genuinely uncertain. The financial legacy of the Camondos operates on multiple levels that are worth disaggregating carefully because they're easily conflated. At the most direct level, the family's banking operations left physical and institutional traces. The buildings they occupied in Galata, some of which still stand, now housing insurance companies and currency exchange offices, and occasionally nothing at all, are physical reminders of what was once one of the most important private financial institutions in the Eastern Mediterranean. The correspondent relationships they helped establish between Ottoman financial institutions and European capital markets became part of the institutional infrastructure of the modern Turkish financial system, even though the lineage is now several institutional generations removed from the Camondo house itself. More broadly, the Camondos' involvement in Ottoman state finance during the Tanzimat period contributed to the development of the financial and administrative modernization that, however incompletely implemented during the Ottoman era, laid some of the groundwork for the Republic of Turkey's economic infrastructure after 1923. Ataturk's modernization program was building on foundations, some of them very shaky, admittedly, that the Tanzimat reformers and their financial partners, including the Camondos, had partially laid. The philanthropic legacy is more directly traceable. In Constantinople, Abraham Salomon Camondo was responsible for founding or substantially funding a remarkable range of institutions, serving the Sephardic Jewish community, schools, synagogues, charitable institutions, housing for the poor. The Camondo Steps, the distinctive curved marble staircase in the Galata district, built by Abraham Salomon Camondo in the 1860s to connect the steep hillside neighborhood to the Galata waterfront, still exist. They appear in travel guides, in photographs, in Instagram posts by visitors who often don't know who built them or why. They are one of the most photographed architectural features of the old Istanbul waterfront. But the most significant and enduring element of the Camondo philanthropic legacy is, unquestionably, the Musée Nissim de Camondo in Paris. The museum, which receives tens of thousands of visitors annually, an impressive number for a specialized decorative arts institution, is not simply a collection of beautiful objects although the objects are extraordinary. It is a space in which the entire Camondo story is available to be experienced layer by layer for anyone who takes the time to engage with it fully. The Camondo Museum has, in recent decades, made a deliberate and admirable decision to not look away from the darkest part of the family's story. The museum's permanent display includes documentation of the deportation and murder of Beatrice Reinach and her family at Auschwitz, a section of the exhibition that stops visitors in their tracks, often literally. You move through rooms of exquisite French decorative arts from the 18th century, and then you encounter photographs of cattle cars and transport lists and death camp records. The juxtaposition is not accidental. It is the museum's way of insisting that the beauty and the tragedy are part of the same story, that you cannot appreciate one without reckoning with the other. What most people miss is the larger historical argument that the Camondo story makes about the trajectory of European Jewish history. The Sephardic Jews who came to the Ottoman Empire in 1492 found in the Ottoman millet system a form of protected minority status that was paternalistic and limiting, but also genuinely protective, a framework that allowed them to maintain their religious identity, their cultural distinctiveness, and their economic activity over centuries of European persecution. The Camondos flourished within that framework, achieved extraordinary success, and used that success to push the boundaries of the protection the empire offered, to expand the legal and social space available to Ottoman Jews. When they moved to Paris, they were trading that framework for another, the framework of French Republican citizenship, with its promise of full legal equality and cultural integration. For 3 generations, that framework appeared to deliver on its promises. And then, it didn't. The question that the Camondo story poses, quietly, devastatingly from the rooms of the museum on the Rue de Monceau, is whether there has ever been a framework anywhere in Europe that genuinely delivered long-term security to Jewish communities. The Ottoman millet system had its limits and its failures. French Republican citizenship had its limits and its catastrophic failure. The lesson is not that one framework was better than the other. The lesson is that the security of minority communities always rests, ultimately, on the goodwill of the majority, and that goodwill is never guaranteed. The Camondo story is also a story about the relationship between financial power and physical safety. Abraham Salomon Camondo had been, at the height of his power, one of the most financially important men in the Ottoman Empire. His family's wealth and connections had provided genuine protection from petty harassment, from arbitrary expropriation, from many of the indignities that less powerful Jewish families faced regularly. But financial power, as the 20th century demonstrated with horrible clarity, provides no protection against a state that has decided to eliminate you regardless of your economic contribution, your cultural integration, or your family's history of service. The Camondo legacy endures in Istanbul, in the Galata steppes, in the Ottoman banking institutions that carried forward the financial modernization that the Camondo house helped initiate, in Paris, in the museum that Moïse built and dedicated to his son, in the academic literature on Ottoman finance, Sephardic history, and the history of European Jewish emancipation, where the Camondo name appears with increasing frequency as historians work to reconstruct the full complexity of 19th century Jewish financial history. And in the moral question that the story insists on posing, about belonging, about safety, about the promises that civilizations make and break, which has lost none of its urgency. So what do we do with all of this? What does it mean for our understanding of finance, of empire, of belonging, of the relationship between wealth and safety, when we step back and look at the full arc of the Camondo story, from the exile of 1492 to the deportation of 1944? That question doesn't have a clean answer, but it demands to be asked. So we've seen how a Sephardic Jewish family, working from the financial margins of the Ottoman Empire, built one of the 19th century's most remarkable banking dynasties, and paid for it with everything. Let me take a moment to step back and look at the full picture. The Camondos were not saints. No financial dynasty operating at that scale and in that era was composed of saints. They participated in financial systems, the tax farming, the state debt management, the currency operations, that extracted real costs from real people at the bottom of the economic hierarchy. Their relationship with Ottoman state power was fundamentally transactional. They provided financial services of genuine value, and in return they received protection, access, and profit. The implicit bargain of their position was always that financial utility provided social and physical security, a calculation that worked impressively well for over a century and then failed completely. Today, 150 years after Abraham Salomon Camondo stood at the peak of his influence, what remains? In Istanbul, those curved marble steps in Galata, tourists photograph them daily. Beautiful, old, slightly mysterious, attributed in the guidebooks to a name that most visitors don't recognize. The financial district that surrounds them has been rebuilt 3 times over since the Camondo banking house occupied its counting rooms there. The physical traces of the Camondo operation in Ottoman finance are largely invisible, absorbed into the institutional history that came after them. In Paris, the museum is something else, something that resists being reduced to a cultural attraction or a historical footnote. It is a place where the full weight of what happened to this family is available to be felt, not just understood intellectually. The Sèvres porcelain that Moïse collected with such care and such love, the photograph of Nissim in his aviator's uniform, the transport list from Drancy, November 1943, Beatrice's name, Leon's name, Fanny's name, Bertrand's name. The real lesson here isn't about banking or empire or the mechanics of 19th century Ottoman finance, as important as all of those things are. It's about the persistent human tragedy of conditional belonging, the way in which communities that build extraordinary things, that contribute beyond measure, that integrate completely, can still find themselves categorized as outsiders when the political winds shift. The Camondos had done everything right by the standards of the civilization they had chosen to join. They were French. They fought for France. They built French institutions and enriched French culture. And it made no difference. Whether we like it or not, the Camondo story is not a story from the past. The pattern it describes, of minority communities whose security depends on the continued goodwill of the majority, whose contributions are accepted while their belonging remains contingent, is not a pattern that history has retired. It is alive, in various forms in multiple parts of the world right now. The specific machinery is different. The vulnerability is the same. The specific machinery is different. The vulnerability is the same. So the question remains, what do we owe to the families who build the financial and cultural infrastructure of our civilizations and then are destroyed by them? What do we do with beauty that was created at that kind of cost? And what does it mean to walk through those rooms on the Rue de Monceau, surrounded by objects of extraordinary loveliness, knowing the full story of the people who collected them? I don't have a clean answer to any of that. I suspect the Camondos wouldn't have had one either. But I think it matters enormously that the question gets asked, and that the people who built those Galata steps, who structured those Ottoman loans, who created that museum, who died in that death camp, that they get to be more than a footnote in someone else's story. They deserve to be remembered whole.